I've been a hospital chaplain for over a decade now, and in all that time, I've learned one thing, above all else hospitals are places where the living and the dead brush up against each other every single day. You see, people don't come to hospitals just to get better. They come to heal, to find solace, to hold on to what little hope they have left. But not all leave with that hope. Sometimes, when death lingers in the halls, it doesn't let go so easily. It was late one evening near the end of my shift, when I was called to room 311. The ward had grown quiet. The usual bustle of nurses' chatter and beeping monitors dimmed to a stillness that echoed in the air. Room 311 was different. It had been different since the day Mrs. Carroll, the patient, was admitted. She was in her early 70s, battling an advanced form of dementia. But it wasn't the dementia that brought her to the unit. It was the cancer that had been eating away at her for months. Her family had been coming in and out for days, saying their goodbyes with a kind of quiet resignation, knowing the end was coming soon. I had spoken with Mrs. Carroll only a few times. She would smile, but it was a distant kind of smile, as though she could never quite connect with me, even though her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived a full life. Her daughter, Anne, had been by her side almost constantly. Anne was a strong woman, but I could see the toll it had taken on her. The sleepless nights, the quiet tears she would shed when she thought no one was watching. I had seen it all too many times before: the helplessness, the fear, the sorrow that never seemed to leave the room. On this particular night, the air in room 311 was thick with it. I had just come from a conversation with Anne, trying to offer whatever comfort I could, when the nurse paged me. Mrs. Carroll had started to decline rapidly. I made my way down the dimly lit corridor, my footsteps muted against the sterile floors. As I entered her room, the first thing that struck me was the sudden drop in temperature. The room, usually warm with the hum of machines, felt cold, and naturally cold. I approached the bed slowly, Anne sitting at her mother's side, her hands clasped tightly together. Mrs. Carroll's face was pale, her breathing shallow. It didn't take a medical expert to know that the end was near. "Chaplain," Anne whispered, her voice tight. "I don't think she has much time left." I nodded gently. But as I took her mother's hand, something shifted in the air. I felt at first a soft pressure, like something pressing against my chest. I looked down at Mrs. Carroll, whose eyes were half open, staring at nothing, but it was just her gaze that caught my attention. It was the faintest whisper of movement in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you've seen too many patients slip away, too many families say goodbye. But as I stood there, the sensation grew stronger. My pulse quickened. There was something else in the room with us, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, like a presence just beyond the edge of the light. I tried to ignore it, focusing on Mrs. Carroll's hand, praying quietly under my breath. But then Anne spoke, her voice barely audible. "Chaplain, do you hear that?" My heart skipped. I looked over at her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the opposite corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker. I didn't want to look. I had been a chaplain long enough to know that sometimes it's better not to acknowledge things you can't explain. But curiosity, that dangerous thing, pulled my gaze toward the corner. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the light, its shape almost translucent, like it wasn't fully part of the world. It stood still, watching us, or rather, watching Mrs. Carroll. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Anne's eyes were wide, her mouth trembling as she reached out, but her hand stopped halfway, as though it couldn't quite reach whatever was there. "Mom, ... Anne whispered, her voice breaking. "Mom, it's time. You don't have to be scared anymore." The figure shifted. It moved slowly, like a shadow drifting across the floor. My mind screamed at me to say something, to comfort Anne, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't take my eyes off that corner. It was like something was drawing me in, pulling me closer to it, and yet every instinct told me to run. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. I blinked, and the room was still again, but something had changed. Mrs. Carroll's breathing had slowed, almost imperceptibly, and her hand squeezed mine. I jerked my attention back to her, but there was no mistaking it. She was gone. The presence in the room, whatever it had been, was gone too. I glanced at Anne, who was holding her mother's hand with a tenderness that I couldn't have imagined moments before. She looked at me, her eyes full of grief, but also a strange kind of peace. "I don't know what happened," she whispered, "but I think she was waiting for something. Someone." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I didn't have any answers, but in that moment I understood. There are things that happen when death arrives, things we can't always see or explain. And sometimes, those things linger a little longer than we expect. We made the necessary arrangements, and I stepped out of the room, leaving Anne to say her final goodbyes. As I walked down the hallway, I felt the familiar chill that had settled in my bones, a coldness that seemed to follow me. I had seen many strange things in my years as a chaplain, but this was different. This was something I couldn't explain, something that refused to stay neatly in the realm of the logical. I don't know who or what it was that was standing in that room with us. I don't know if it was a spirit, a memory, or something else entirely. All I know is that Mrs. Carroll passed in peace, her journey completed, and whatever had been waiting for her, whatever presence had lingered, had finally left too. The next morning, I passed room 311 again, the door now shut, the hallway quiet. I didn't linger. Some things are best left untouched. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room, that space, was holding on to something that would be carried forward in ways I might never understand. And as I step into new rooms, new lives, I carry that weight with me, knowing that there are stories here, in these walls, that will never quite be finished. Sometimes, the hardest part of this job isn't finding the answers. It's knowing that there are some things you're never meant to solve. You just carry them. I've been a hospital chaplain for more years than I care to count, and I've seen the things that make your skin crawl. Hospitals are places where the boundary between life and death is picked in. Every day, people come in hoping for miracles, but not everyone leaves with one. Sometimes though, there are moments that defy any kind of rational explanation. It was a late shift, just a few hours before my relief would come. The hospital was quieter than usual, the kind of night when everything slows down, and you find yourself walking through the halls like you're moving through a dream. I had just finished a visit with a family in palliative care, and the feeling of quiet grief hung in the air. That's when the nurse pager went off, calling me to room 200. Room 216 had been occupied by Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman in her late 80s, who had been fighting a losing battle with cancer for months. Her family had been around the clock, but tonight, they were all gone for a while. It was just Mrs. Harper and the steady hum of the machines. When I walked into the room, it was as if the air had been sucked out. It wasn't that the room was cold, but there was a heavy stillness to it, as though something waited for me to acknowledge it. Mrs. Harper was in bed, her frail body wrapped in the thin sheets, her breathing shallow and faint. I could tell she was in the final stages. Her daughter Sarah had just stepped out for a brief break, her exhaustion written all over her face. I sat by Mrs. Harper's side, offering a prayer. I had said the words 1,000 times before, each one flowing as naturally as the last. But tonight, something felt different. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and the stillness in the room became deafening. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there with us. A sudden shift in the room's atmosphere made my heart race. It wasn't just my imagination, I could feel it. A coldness, a presence. I looked up from Mrs. Harper's hand, scanning the room, but there was nothing. The machines were quiet, save for their steady beeping, and Sarah hadn't returned yet. I tried to ignore it, but the unease gnawed at me. I glanced toward the far corner of the room. At first I thought it was just the way the light was hitting the window, casting strange shadows. But then I saw it, a dark figure, standing at the edge of the room, just outside the pool of light. It was a shape, nothing more, but it felt ... wrong. It didn't belong in the room, in the world, and yet it was there. I swallowed hard, feeling the coldness wrap around me. My hand hovered over the call button as I tried to shake the unease, but the figure didn't move. It stayed frozen, watching. I could feel my breath catch in my chest. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or supernatural occurrences, but something in that moment told me I wasn't alone. The figure remained motionless, and I started to question myself. Was I just tired? Was I imagining it? I wasn't sure. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was no longer just a hospital room. It had become something more. The air felt thicker, more oppressive. A low rustling sound broke the silence. I turned toward Mrs. Harper's bed and saw her hand twitch. It wasn't much, just a subtle movement, but it was enough to make me freeze. Mrs. Harper's eyes were closed, but her breathing had stopped. I knew what that meant. The end had come. I had barely finished whispering a prayer when I heard it. A soft, slow knock at the door. My heart skipped, and I turned sharply. The door was slightly ajar, but there was no one there. The hallway outside was empty, the lights flickering softly in the distance. I stood frozen, staring at the door. Then I felt something brushing against my arm. I jumped back, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, no one. And yet, I couldn't shake the sensation. It felt as though someone had just touched me, cold fingers grazing my skin. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. I stepped back toward the door, but as I did, I glanced at the figure in the corner once more. It was still there, watching, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I rushed out of the room and into the hallway, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold lingering in my skin. I went straight to the nurse's station, trying to steady myself, but the nurse on duty just looked at me with confusion when I asked if anyone had been near room 216 recently. "No," she said, "no one's been there." But I could still feel the weight of that room, the sensation of something watching me from the shadows. When I returned to the room, Mrs. Harper's body had been removed, and her daughter Sarah was back, quietly speaking with the staff. I didn't say anything about what I'd felt. There was no need. What good would it do to add to the burden of grief she was already carrying? I finished the paperwork and walked down the hallway, my legs heavy with exhaustion. But as I passed the doors of room 216 once more, I glanced toward it. The door was closed now, but the coldness was still there, creeping into my bones. And as I walked past, I could have sworn I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the hospital, like someone calling my name from the other side of the door. I've walked these halls long enough to know that there are things we can't explain, but tonight something stayed with me. I can't say for certain what it was or what it meant, but I carry it with me now. Some nights, when the hospital is quiet, and the shadows stretch too long, I feel that same coldness again. And I wonder if there's something, or someone, waiting for me to step into the room. I'm not sure I want to know the answer, but I can't shake the feeling that some doors are never really closed. I've worked as a hospital chaplain for more years than I care to admit, and in that time, I've seen enough to make anyone question what they know about life and death. The hospital, as much as it's a place of healing, is also a place where strange things happen. Sometimes, the line between the living and the dead feels more like a shadow than a boundary. And on nights like this, I'm reminded of that. When I was called to room 420, the nurse on the other end of the pager had sounded tense. "Chaplain, could you come to room 420? The patient's family is requesting your presence." I didn't need to ask why. Room 420 had been occupied by a man named Mr. Henderson. He was in his late 60s, battling end-stage heart failure. His family had been visiting in shifts for days, hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come. The prognosis was clear: he wasn't going to make it through the night, but the family was holding on, as people often do in these final hours. I walked down the long hallway, my footsteps muffled by the carpet beneath my shoes. As I entered the room, I found Mr. Henderson's wife, Jean, sitting at his bedside. Her eyes were red. We sat together in silence for a while. Jean didn't seem to mind the quiet. She had said all she needed to say. Her words spent, I offered a prayer, as I often do in these moments, hoping to give them some comfort. But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the strange sensation that something wasn't right. The air in the room felt too still, too thick. It was as though the room had become frozen in time, and then, just as I finished the prayer, the heart monitor let out a sharp, blaring beep. I looked at the screen. Mr. Henderson's heart had stopped. I glanced over at Jean, who seemed almost relieved, as though the waiting had been more painful than the actual passing. Marcus, still staring out the window, didn't react at all. But then, something strange happened. The monitor stopped. The room fell silent again. But there was a moment, a brief, fleeting moment when the temperature in the room dropped. I felt it first, a chill that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. No windows were open. The door hadn't been disturbed. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the room with us. The air was heavy, thick, pressing in on me. I tried to focus, to steady my breath, but the unease kept growing. I glanced back at the bed and saw something strange. Mr. Henderson's fingers had moved. Not much, but just enough to catch my eye. They twitched, a subtle motion, as though they were reaching for something or someone. I stood up, unable to suppress the unease any longer. "Jean," I said, my voice low, "I think you should say your goodbyes now." She looked up at me, her face pale but resigned. "He's gone, isn't he?" she asked. I nodded. "His heart has stopped." But as I turned to leave the room, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper like a voice carried on the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. But the feeling of being watched remained, an unseen presence lingering in the corners of the room. I glanced at the door, thinking perhaps someone had entered without my noticing, but it remained closed, as it had been when I entered. Without another word, I left the room, stepping into the hallway where the lights were flickering faintly. I tried to shake the feeling. It lingers a little longer than we expect, and sometimes it leaves behind traces that only those who pay close enough attention can feel. As I walked down the hall that morning, I felt the chill of that room still clinging to my skin, a reminder that in this place, the line between life and death is never as clear as we like to believe. I've been a hospital chaplain long enough to know that some nights are quieter than others. Most nights I walk the halls with purpose, moving from one room to the next, offering a quiet word, a prayer, or a listening ear to those in need. But some nights there's something in the air that feels different. It's as if the walls themselves hold their breath, waiting for something to happen. That particular evening, The atmosphere in the hospital was thick with tension. I had just finished a visit with a family in palliative care and was heading down the long corridor to the IC when I was paged to room 712. The nurse who called me sounded urgent, though she didn't say why. That alone was enough to make my heart beat a little faster. There's a certain tone in a nurse's voice when they're unsure of something, and I'd learned to recognize it. I made my way up to the room, the lights overhead flickering slightly as I moved through the hallway. It was late, nearly midnight, and the hospital had that quiet hum to it, the kind that comes when most of the world has gone to sleep. Room 712 was at the end of the hall, far from the main nursing station, and when I reached it, I could already hear the faint sound of someone crying from inside. I knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. Inside, I found a middle-aged man sitting in a chair beside the bed, his face drawn and tired. His wife, Gloria, lay motionless in the bed, her breath shallow, her eyes closed. She had been battling terminal cancer for months, and it was clear she was nearing the end. The man, whose name I later learned was Richard, was holding her hand tightly. When he looked up, his face was a mask of sorrow, but there was something else there too, a sort of unease, as though he was afraid of what might happen next. "Chaplain," he said, his voice hoarse, "I think she's holding on for me. I don't know how much longer I can... I don't know how much longer I can take this." I nodded, sitting beside him. I didn't need to say much. In moments like these, words don't always help. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is simply be present. I placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what comfort I could. For a few minutes, we sat in silence, watching Gloria as she lay there, her labored breaths filling the room. But then, something strange happened. I noticed the temperature in the room had dropped. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was enough to make me feel it. I glanced at Richard, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on his wife, his grip on her hand tightening with each passing moment. As I sat there, trying to process what I was feeling, I noticed the room's lights flicker once, then twice, before returning to normal. It was odd, but not unheard of. Hospitals are full of old wiring and strange electrical quirks. Still, it unsettled me. My attention was pulled back to Gloria. Her face, which had been pale and still, began to shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but I could swear her lips twitched, just a little. Her eyes fluttered open. I wasn't sure if she was truly conscious or if it was just a reflex, but Richard noticed it too. He leaned forward, his voice breaking. "Gloria, are you awake? Please, honey, don't go yet." But instead of responding, her lips formed the faintest of smiles, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a sad, distant smile, as if she wasn't really there at all. I wasn't sure what to say. I had been a chaplain long enough to know that the dying often hold on in their own ways. Sometimes they wait for a specific moment, or a specific person, but this felt different. Something about Gloria's expression, her eyes empty, unfocused, felt wrong. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't stop. The room plunged into darkness for a brief moment before the emergency backup lights kicked in, casting an eerie yellow glow over the room. The hum of the machines in the background, the steady beep of her heart monitor, seemed to slow, as if they too were holding their breath. I stood up quickly, instinctively reaching for the call button by the bed. Richard looked at me, his face pale. He was shaking his head. "I swear, Chaplain... I swear. She doesn't want to leave," he whispered. "I've been talking to her. I've been asking her to hold on, and she's been... responding." I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that maybe he was imagining it all. But there was something about the room that made me uneasy, something more than just the usual sadness that comes with these moments. It was as though the very air was charged with something that didn't belong. And then, just as I was about to say something to comfort him, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper voice, but not Gloria's. "Richard... It came from the corner of the room, and it was so faint that I was unsure if it was real or just the stress of the night playing tricks on me. But Richard heard it too. He turned his head sharply, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Did you hear someone call my name?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. The voice was unmistakable, but there was no one else in the room. The air in the corner was unnaturally cold now, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I moved toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there, just an empty space. Richard stood up, his hand still gripping Gloria's, and his face was a mixture of fear and confusion. "Chaplain, what's happening? What's going on?" I didn't have an answer. I could feel it now, something in the room, a presence that wasn't human. It wasn't Gloria, and it wasn't Richard either. It was something else entirely, something old, something that didn't belong. Before I could say anything else, the heart monitor flatlined. The sharp, shrill sound filled the room, and Gloria's hand slipped from Richard's grip. Her face went still, her expression frozen in that strange, sad smile. Richard collapsed to his knees, his sobs filling the space. But as I stood there, the room began to grow colder still, the whisper lingering in the air like a distant echo. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The corner of the room where the cold seemed to gather was darker now, and for a split second I thought I saw something moving there, something shadowed, something that shouldn't be. I left the room quietly, not wanting to disturb Richard in his grief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. The presence, the voice, it was still there, clinging to the walls, to the air, to the space where Gloria had just passed. Hospitals are full of things we don't understand, and sometimes those things stay with you long after you walk away. It's as if the spaces where life and death intersect don't always close as neatly as we want them to. And when I walked past room 712 the next morning, the door was closed, but I could still feel it, whatever lingered in the air, waiting for someone else to walk through. I've been a hospital chaplain for more than a decade, long enough to learn that death is often a quiet, subtle thing. Most of the time, it arrives with a slow fade-in, inevitable, gentle slipping away that feels almost natural. But every so often, something happens in these sterile halls, something that doesn't feel quite right, something that lingers long after the moment has passed. One particular night stands out in my memory, a night I still don't fully understand. It was a night shift, quiet and uneventful at first. I'd just finished a round of visits, offering comfort to families, a prayer here and there, when I was called to room 508. The request was simple. The family needed pastoral support. I didn't think much of it, these calls were routine. But this time, I walked into something I couldn't explain. Room 508 was at the end of the hall, a room many of us had walked past without giving it much thought. It wasn't the kind of room you'd remember, just another hospital bed, a patient clinging to the fragile thread of life. When I stepped inside, the first thing that struck me was the smell of sterile, antiseptic scent, mixed with something faintly sweet, like flowers that had long since wilted. The patient, a woman named Marjorie, was in her mid-60s. She had been diagnosed with terminal liver cancer several months ago. Her family had been around, taking turns keeping vigil, though I hadn't seen anyone in the room at the moment. Marjorie was alone, her breathing shallow, her skin pale and cold to the touch. I could tell she was nearing the end, but it wasn't just her condition that felt off. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on it. I sat quietly by her side, offering my presence, waiting for whatever words might come to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The lights above flickered once, then again, before returning to their usual steady hum. At first I dismissed it as just the usual quirks of an old building, but then I heard it, a soft, faint sound, like a whisper. I glanced up, half expecting to see one of the nurses or a family member entering, but there was no one. The room was still. The whisper continued, low and unintelligible, like someone murmuring just beyond the reach of comprehension. It sent a shiver down my spine. I stood up, walking around the bed, trying to shake off the unease that was beginning to settle over me. But when I reached the far corner of the room, I froze. There, standing in the shadowed corner, was a figure, a woman. Her back was to me, her form outlined by the dim light that spilled through the half-open blinds. I could make out the shape of her, but not the details, her hair, her clothes. They were all wrong somehow, as though they didn't quite belong in this room, in this time. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty corner, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't make sense of it. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in perception, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something in that room, something I couldn't see but could feel. The air had become even colder, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I sat back down by Marjorie's bedside, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Her breathing had slowed, so much so that I wasn't sure if she was still alive. I checked her pulse, just to be sure. It was faint, almost imperceptible. I whispered a prayer, the words feeling somehow hollow in the thick silence. And then, without warning, the lights above flickered again, this time more violently. The sound of something brushing the floor, like a chair being scraped across tile, echoed through the room. I looked up, my heart racing, but the room was unchanged. Marjorie remained still, her eyes closed, her face serene. That's when I noticed it, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but not coming from Marjorie. It was coming from the corner. I didn't want to look, I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly turned my head toward the far side of the room, where the figure had stood, and there, standing in the same place, was the woman again. This time, her face was visible. I saw her clearly, her features pale and gaunt, her eyes dark, sunken, like someone who had been dead for years. She was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a twisted, hungry grin, as if she was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I wanted to run, to get out of that room as quickly as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, caught in the gaze of this woman who should not have been there. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows like smoke. I don't remember what happened next. My mind was reeling. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. Marjorie's condition had worsened. The monitors showed a flat line where a steady rhythm had once been. I called for help, but by the time the nurse arrived, it was too late. Marjorie had passed. Later, when I told the nurse what I had seen, she looked at me like I was crazy. She explained that Marjorie had been alone for hours. Her family had left for the night, and no one had entered or exited the room during my visit. There were no other patients nearby, no visitors, and no reason for the strange occurrences. I tried to push it from my mind, to tell myself that it was just the stress of the job, the long hours, the weight of grief pressing in. But there's something about the hospital, something in the walls and the air, that makes you question what you think you know. The next day I went back to the ward, the same routine. I passed by room 508 and the door was shut. I didn't stop, I couldn't. The memory of the figure, the whispers, the coldness, stayed with me, as real as the floors beneath my feet. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that room 508 would never be the same again, that some places, some moments, never truly let go. That the dead leave their marks in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes, we're forced to carry those marks with us, whether we understand them or not. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every comment adds a new shadow to our haunted corner of the internet. Share this if you know someone who enjoys a good scare. More spine-chilling stories are coming soon, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Thanks for watching if you dare.